The telegram arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon, and no one considered it urgent. The Hartley Alpine Survey expedition had been camped at the 14-mile station in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado for 11 days in February 1902. They were cataloging mineral deposits for the United States Geological Survey. 3 geologists, 2 engineers, a surveyor, a photographer, and 4 camp assistants. 14 people in total, none of them strangers to winter field work. The camp sat at 11,200 feet, sheltered in a bowl of spruce and exposed granite, accessible by a supply trail that switchbacked down through timber and eventually met the railroad spur at Silverton, 23 miles to the southeast. Weather forecasts in 1902 were communicated by telegraph when stations were available, and by visual observation when they were not. The Denver office of the Weather Bureau issued storm warnings based on barometric readings and reports from railroad operators, mining camps, and military posts. The warning that reached Silverton on the afternoon of February 11th indicated a low-pressure system moving east from Utah, expected to bring snow to the high country beginning the following day. Accumulation was forecast at 12 to 18 inches over 48 hours. Winds moderate to strong. The camp received the message via a runner employed by the Silverton to Animas Forks mail route, a young man named Samuel Dorch, who made the climb twice weekly when conditions allowed. He handed the folded paper to the expedition leader, Dr. Edwin Hartley, a 41-year-old geologist from Yale who had worked 3 previous winters in mountain environments. Hartley read it, folded it again, and placed it in his field journal without annotation. The photographer, Charles Ivers, later testified that Hartley remarked only that they had plenty of time to decide. The remark was not recorded as alarming. Ivers himself noted in his diary that evening, "Weather warning received. Expect snow tomorrow. Work continues." His tone suggests neither concern nor preparation. At that moment, the expedition was 2 weeks ahead of schedule. They had completed mapping along the eastern ridge and were beginning surveys of the western drainage. The original plan called for departure on February 20th, with return to Silverton scheduled for the 22nd. February 11th, by that reckoning, was early. The assumption, shared across the group and reflected in multiple diary entries, was that departure could be adjusted as needed. No one considered the trail impassable yet. No one had reason to. Dinner that night was stew and cornbread, served in the communal tent at 6:30 p.m. The temperature was 22 degrees. The evening log, kept by the surveyor Martin Oswald, notes that after the meal, several men played cards. 2 repaired equipment. 1 wrote letters by lamplight. Hartley spent an hour reviewing maps. At 9:15, the camp retired. The night was clear. In a letter discovered later among Hartley's personal papers, written to his wife but never mailed, he mentioned the telegram briefly. "Weather notice came today," he wrote. "Nothing we haven't seen before. We'll watch the glass and adjust if needed." The letter was dated February 11th, 1902. Beneath it, in the same portfolio, was a handwritten note on USGS stationery, undated but presumed to be from the 12th. It read, "Barometer dropping faster than expected. Discussed options with Oswald. Agreed we should start packing by midday tomorrow if trend continues." That note was found in Hartley's coat pocket. The archives contain one further detail. On the evening of February 11th, the expedition's lead engineer, Robert Fentress, made an entry in his personal journal. It was brief. "Hartley says we'll watch the weather. Trail's still open. Could leave in the morning if we wanted to." They did not leave in the morning. Routine is a form of certainty. The Hartley expedition had established one. Every morning began at 6 a.m. with the lighting of the cook stove. Breakfast was oatmeal, coffee, and whatever bread remained from the previous day's baking. The men dressed in layers, wool union suits, flannel shirts, canvas trousers, leather boots greased against moisture. By 7, work parties dispersed. The geologist to the outcrops, the engineers to the claims they were assessing, the surveyor to his benchmarks. The photographer followed whichever group promised the most documentary value. The camp assistants maintained the fires, hauled water from a nearby creek, and prepared the midday meal. This rhythm had not varied in 11 days. It did not vary on February 12th. The snow began before dawn. Ivers wrote that he woke to the sound of it against the canvas. Soft, persistent, heavier than he had expected. By first light, 3 inches had accumulated. The sky was the color of pewter. Visibility extended perhaps a quarter mile before the ridgeline vanished into cloud. Hartley consulted the barometer at 6:45 a.m. It had fallen another 0.2 of an inch since the previous evening. He noted this in his log but did not call a meeting. Fentress, who bunked in the same tent, later recalled that Hartley said, "We'll see how it looks by noon." This was not unreasonable. Mountain storms often moved through quickly, depositing their load and clearing within hours. The expedition had weathered 2 previous snowfalls without incident. On January 28th, 8 inches had fallen overnight. By the following afternoon, the trail had been passable again. On February 4th, a brief squall had dusted the camp with 4 inches, then stopped. Both events had reinforced a belief that storms in the San Juans were forceful but finite, and that the proper response was patience rather than haste. The men went to work. Oswald and one assistant hiked to a surveying station a half-mile north. The geologists, Hartley, Dr. Thomas Brennan, and Dr. Alice Moss, the only woman in the party, examined a quartz outcrop to the west. Ivers accompanied them. Fentress and the second engineer, James Ridley, remained in camp to repair a theodolite stand. The other assistants tended to chores. The snow continued. By mid-morning, accumulation had reached 6 inches. The temperature held steady at 18 degrees. There was no wind. The snow fell vertically, thick and soft, muffling sound. Ivers photographed the outcrop work. One image survives in the USGS archive. Dr. Moss standing beside a fractured ledge, holding a rock hammer, her expression calm, snow collecting on the brim of her hat. The photograph is labeled February 12, 1902, 10:20 a.m. It shows no urgency. At 11:30, the field parties returned to camp for the midday meal. Hartley checked the barometer again. It had dropped another 1/10 of an inch. He discussed this with Oswald and Fentress. The conversation was witnessed by 2 of the assistants, who later gave depositions. One, a man named Eugene Lowe, recalled Hartley saying, "If this keeps up, we'll need to leave tomorrow morning." Fentress agreed. Oswald suggested they could begin packing that afternoon, just to be ready. Hartley considered this. Then he said, "Let's give it until evening. If it's still coming down hard, we'll pack tonight." No one objected. The decision reflected a shared understanding that leaving in the middle of a snowfall was more dangerous than waiting for it to pass. Trails obscured by falling snow were difficult to follow. Visibility mattered. The assumption was that the storm would taper off by nightfall, and they could depart the following morning under clearing skies. This was the pattern they had observed before. It was also a miscalculation of scale. After lunch, the men resumed work, though closer to camp now. Hartley and Brennan reviewed maps in the command tent. Moss organized rock samples. Ivers cleaned camera lenses and repaired a light leak in one of his plate holders. The assistants chopped firewood and checked the tent lines, tightening them against the weight of accumulating snow. By 3:00 p.m., accumulation had reached 10 inches. By 5:00 p.m., 14 inches. The wind began at dusk. It came from the northwest, not strong at first, but steady, driving the snow horizontally across the camp. Visibility dropped to less than 100 feet. The temperature fell to 12 degrees. Hartley called the group together at 6 p.m. in the cook tent. He stood near the stove, his journal open on the table. The assistants and engineers sat on benches. The geologists stood. "We'll leave at first light," Hartley said. His voice, according to Lowe's testimony, was calm. "Storm's bigger than forecast. No sense waiting it out. Pack what you need tonight, cache the rest. We travel light." There were no questions. The decision felt correct. It also felt, as Fentress later put it, like we were still in control. They were not. The packing began at 7:00 p.m. Each man was responsible for his own kit, bedroll, personal effects, a share of food and fuel. The heavier equipment, surveying instruments, ore samples, photographic plates, was to be left in weatherproof cases and retrieved later. The process was methodical. It took 3 hours. By 10 p.m., 20 inches of snow had fallen. The wind had increased to what Oswald estimated as 30 miles per hour, gusting higher. The tents shuddered and snapped. Drifts were forming on the windward side of camp, some already 3 feet deep. Hartley ordered the men to sleep in their clothes, ready to move. The last entry in Ivor's diary that night was brief. Packed and ready, leave at dawn. Should be fine. The assumption embedded in that sentence, that departure at dawn would still be possible, was the assumption that killed them. Dawn on February 13th did not arrive so much as the darkness thinned to grey. The storm had not stopped. If anything, it had intensified. By 6:01 a.m., when Hartley emerged from his tent, snow depth at the camp was measured, later by searchers, at 32 inches. Drifts against the western tree line exceeded 5 feet. The wind was sustained at 40 miles per hour, with gusts strong enough to knock a man sideways. Visibility was less than 20 feet. The temperature was 9 degrees. Hartley stood in the open for less than a minute before returning to the tent. Fentress, already awake, asked what he had seen. "Nothing," Hartley said. They waited. At 7 a.m., Hartley convened the group in the cook tent. The stove was roaring, but the tent itself was cold. Snow had sifted through seams in the canvas and formed small drifts along the interior walls. The men sat close together. Moss stood near the entrance, her arms crossed. Hartley spoke without preamble. "We can't move in this," he said. "Visibility's gone. Drifts are too deep. We wait for a break." No one disagreed. The decision was obvious. What was not obvious, what could not have been obvious to anyone in that tent at that moment, was that they had just missed their last chance. The storm continued through the morning. By 10 a.m., snow depth exceeded 3 feet in the clearings, and drifts in the timber were impassable. The trail they had used to reach the camp 11 days earlier no longer existed as a visible feature. It was buried under snow that had no surface variation, no markers, no recognizable form. The mountain had become featureless. Hartley checked the barometer every 2 hours. It had stabilized, but low. The storm was not passing. It was settling. At noon, he consulted with Oswald and Fentress again. The 3 men stood outside the command tent, leaning into the wind, shouting to be heard. "How long can we hold?" Hartley asked. "Depends on the fuel," Fentress said. "And food." They had firewood for perhaps 5 more days if they rationed heat to the cook tent and command tent only. Food would last a week, maybe 10 days if stretched. Water was not a concern. They could melt snow. The calculation was simple. They had resources to wait out the storm, but not indefinitely. "What if it doesn't stop?" Oswald asked. Hartley did not answer immediately. Then he said, "It will." That assumption, unspoken but shared, was that storms did not last. They were events, not conditions. They began, peaked, and ended. The men had seen this before, and so they believed it would happen again. The possibility that this storm might be different in kind, not just in degree, did not yet register as real. It should have. Records from the Denver Weather Bureau, reviewed months later, show that the low-pressure system stalled over southwestern Colorado on the evening of February 12th. A secondary system, moving down from the plains, merged with it on the 13th. The combined system remained stationary for 4 days. Total snowfall in the high San Juans during that period exceeded 9 feet. Winds averaged 35 miles per hour, with gusts to 60. Temperatures remained below 15 degrees. The Hartley expedition had no way of knowing this. At 2 p.m. on February 13th, the wind eased slightly. Visibility improved to perhaps 50 yards. Hartley and Brennan ventured to the edge of camp, attempting to locate the trail. They returned 20 minutes later, covered in snow, unable to find any trace of it. "We'll try again when it clears," Hartley said. The men nodded. They returned to the tents. They waited. The storm did not clear. February 14th brought heavier snow and stronger winds. The tents were now half buried. Digging them out required constant effort. The cook tent's ridgepole cracked under the load at midday, and the men spent 2 hours reinforcing it with a spare surveying staff. Firewood consumption increased. The cold was relentless. Food stocks, reviewed by Lowe, were sufficient for 6 more days. On February 15th, the wind shifted to the northeast and intensified. One of the supply tents collapsed entirely. The men salvaged what they could and consolidated into the remaining structures. Hartley rationed heat to 2 fires, one in the cook tent, one in the command tent where the geologists and engineers slept. The assistants and photographer moved into the cook tent. Ivers's diary entries during this period became shorter. February 14th. Storm continues, no visibility, waiting. February 15th. Tent collapsed, moved, still snowing. February 16th. No change. There was no panic in these entries. There was only a growing awareness that something had gone wrong. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but incrementally, in a way that felt almost bureaucratic. They had made a decision to wait. The wait had lengthened, and now, quietly, without announcement, the situation had transitioned from inconvenient to dangerous. Hartley understood this. On the evening of February 16th, he wrote a letter, not to his wife this time, but to the USGS office in Denver. It was a formal report, methodical and precise. He described the storm, the snow depth, the fuel and food situation. He noted that the group was in good health and morale was stable. He concluded, "We will attempt to depart as soon as visibility permits. If conditions do not improve within 3 days, we may require assistance." The letter was found in his tent 6 weeks later, unsent. There was no way to send it. The moment they could have left, the narrow window on the morning of February 12th, before the snow became impassable, had closed so gradually that no one had recognized it as a threshold. They had assumed there would be time later. There was not. On February 17th, the snow stopped. The silence after the storm was noted by the first rescue party to reach the camp on March 9th, 25 days after the snow had stopped falling. The search had been organized by the USGS after the expedition failed to return to Silverton by the expected date of February 22nd. Initial attempts to reach 14 Mile Station were turned back by snow depth and unstable avalanche conditions. A second attempt on March 3rd reached within 6 miles before weather forced a retreat. The third attempt, led by a professional guide named Albert Keene and staffed by volunteers from Silverton and Ouray, succeeded in reaching the camp on March 9th. Keene's written report, filed with the county coroner on March 12th, describes what they found. The camp was intact. The tents were standing, though heavily drifted and sagging under the weight of settled snow. The cook tent's entrance was partially cleared, suggesting recent effort. The command tent was sealed. The supply tent that had collapsed on February 15th was still down, its contents scattered and half buried. Inside the cook tent, they found 9 bodies. All were lying in bedrolls, arranged in a rough circle around the remains of the stove. The stove was cold. There was no firewood. The bodies showed no signs of trauma or struggle. Keene noted that they appeared as though asleep. In the command tent, they found 5 more bodies. 3 were in bedrolls. 2, later identified as Hartley and Moss, were seated at the map table, both fully dressed. Hartley's journal lay open in front of him. The final entry was dated February 27th, 15 days after the expedition had decided to wait. The entry read, "Fuel exhausted. Last fire this morning. Temperatures have not risen above 0 in 4 days. Food remains, but no means to melt snow for water. Discussed attempting to walk out. Snow too deep. Group agrees to remain. Assistance expected. No reason to believe otherwise." There was no entry after that. The coroner's inquest, held in Silverton on March 15, 1902, concluded that all 14 members of the Hartley expedition had died of exposure, complicated by dehydration and exhaustion. The inquiry noted that the group had possessed adequate supplies to survive the storm's duration, but had been unable to generate sufficient heat or mobility to remain viable once fuel was exhausted. The report concluded, the deceased exercised reasonable judgment given the information available to them. The severity and duration of the storm exceeded all historical precedent for the region. No fault was assigned, but the archive tells a different story, one not of blame, but of irony. Among the recovered materials was a letter from the Denver Weather Bureau to the Silverton Telegraph Office. dated February 13th, 1902. It was an updated forecast, issued after the secondary system had merged with the first. The letter warned of exceptional snowfall and prolonged storm conditions in the San Juan high country, with accumulations possibly exceeding 5 feet and duration estimated at 4 to 6 days. It recommended immediate evacuation of all high-altitude camps. The letter arrived in Silverton on the afternoon of February 13th. By that time, the trail to 14 Mile Station was already impassable. There was no way to deliver it. The runner, Samuel Dorch, who had carried the first telegram on February 11th, testified that he had intended to make another trip on the 12th, but had been advised by the station agent that conditions were too dangerous. "I asked if I should try anyway," Dorch said. "He told me to wait for clearing, said there was no rush, nobody thought they were in trouble yet." Fentress's journal, recovered from the command tent, contained a passage dated February 19th, 1 week after the group had decided to wait. It read, "Hartley believes rescue party will reach us within days. Brennan less certain. Discussed rationing in detail. Moss suggested attempting to dig out the trail ourselves. Impractical. Snow too deep and no energy to spare. We are all weaker now. Agreed to conserve strength and wait." The phrasing is significant. Wait appears in every journal recovered from the camp. Wait for the storm to pass. Wait for conditions to improve. Wait for help. The verb becomes a mantra, repeated with decreasing conviction but never abandoned. On February 23rd, 2 days after the original departure date, Oswald wrote, "We should have left earlier, obvious now. At the time, it did not seem so." On February 25th, Ivers wrote, "Discussed what we could have done differently. Hartley says we made the best decision with the information we had. I think he is right. I also think we are going to die here." The final photographs taken by Ivers were developed later from plates found in his equipment case. They show the camp on February 20th, 9 days into the storm. The images are starkly composed. A tent half buried in snow, its canvas taut and white. A row of boots outside the cook tent, frozen solid. A man, identity unclear, standing at the edge of the clearing, looking toward the tree line, his posture suggesting neither panic nor hope, only a kind of exhausted patience. The last photograph in the sequence shows the interior of the cook tent. The men are gathered around the stove. One is reading, 2 are lying down. The others sit upright, hands extended toward the fire. Their faces are calm. There is no visible distress. Ivers captioned the image in pencil on the plate envelope. February 20th, 1902. Waiting. When the rescue party reached Silverton with the bodies on March 11th, a crowd gathered at the station. Among them was Samuel Dorch, the mail runner. A reporter from the Silverton Standard asked him if he felt the expedition could have been saved. Dorch's response was recorded in the newspaper's March 13th edition. "They could have walked out on the 12th, he said. "Trail was still there that morning. I know because I could still see my tracks from the day before. By noon, it was gone." The reporter asked why they had not left. "Because they didn't think they had to," Dorch said. "The archive does not assign blame because blame requires intent, and intent requires knowledge. The Hartley expedition possessed neither. What they possessed was experience, competence, and a reasonable expectation that the future would resemble the past. They had survived storms before. They had made decisions before. They had waited before. Each time, the logic had held. The trail had reopened. The weather had cleared. The margin between caution and danger had remained intact. February 1902 erased that margin without warning. The historian reviewing the materials a century later sees the pattern. The telegram on the 11th. The first snow on the 12th. The decision to wait. The closing of the window. The long, silent erosion of options. It is a sequence that feels inevitable in retrospect, but which was not, could not have been, inevitable to the people living it. Dr. Edwin Hartley was an experienced geologist. He had led expeditions in Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. He had published 17 papers on alpine mineral formations. He understood mountain weather. He understood risk. And yet, on the morning of February 12, 1902, he made a decision that seemed, at the time, entirely rational. to wait. He was not wrong to wait. He was wrong to believe he would know when waiting became fatal. The distinction is subtle, but essential. The tragedy of the Hartley expedition is not that they failed to act, but that they failed to recognize that the moment to act was passing. They treated the storm as a problem of endurance when it was in fact a problem of timing. By the time they understood this, by the time the snow depth, the cold and the isolation had made their situation clear, there was nothing left to do but wait for an outcome they could no longer influence. The last assumption they made was the worst one. That help would come. It did, but too late. In the years following the disaster, the USGS revised its protocols for high-altitude winter fieldwork. Expeditions were required to carry emergency rations sufficient for 3 weeks. Weather forecasts were to be treated as minimum risk scenarios, not maximum. Departure windows were to be calculated conservatively, with evacuation triggered by the first sign of deteriorating conditions rather than the last. These were sensible reforms. They were also, in a sense, beside the point, because the central lesson of the Hartley expedition is not procedural. It is psychological. It is the lesson that danger does not announce itself, that crisis does not arrive with fanfare, that the moment when action is still possible often feels indistinguishable from the moment when it is not. The men at 14 Mile Station did not die because they were reckless. They died because they were reasonable. They assessed the situation, weighed their options, and chose to wait. The choice was logical. The outcome was not. And perhaps that is the most unsettling aspect of the archive, how ordinary the decision-making appears. There is no moment of obvious error. No catastrophic mistake. No clear villain. Only a series of small defensible judgments that, in aggregate, led to a conclusion no one intended and everyone regretted. The camp at 14 Mile Station was never reoccupied. The USGS completed its surveys of the San Juan high country using summer expeditions exclusively. The site itself was left undisturbed, marked only by a brass plaque installed by the Colorado Historical Society in 1954. The plaque lists the names of the 14 dead and gives the dates of the expedition. It does not explain what happened. The explanation is in the archive. It is in Hartley's unsent letters, in Oswald's barometric readings, in Ivar's photographs of men standing in snow, waiting for a storm to pass. In Fentress's journal entry, "We should have left earlier." It is in the silence that followed. The story of the Hartley expedition is not a story of heroism or cowardice, triumph or folly. It is a story of misjudgment so incremental that it felt, at every stage, like prudence. It is a story of people who believed they had time, and who learned, too late, that time is not a resource one possesses, but a condition one inhabits, and which can end without notice. The last photograph taken by Charles Ivers, the one showing the men around the stove, is preserved in the USGS archive in Denver. It is mounted under glass, labeled with the date and location, and filed under Field Disasters, 1902. The men in the photograph are not smiling, but they are not despairing either. They are simply there, in the moment, waiting for what comes next. They look like people who still believe they will survive. They were wrong.